Guys, thanks for coming in again for one more of our publics. If I could request all the people at the back to just sort of come in a little front, because anybody who's walking in later will occupy the seats behind. I'm going to hand it over to our director, Aruma Ravi, to introduce our featured speaker today.
Thanks. So just very quickly, as people sort of trickle in, I'm very glad to sort of introduce Professor Bert de Vries, who's a very old friend. We've known each other and worked together for maybe 30 years. He's going to be talking about an interesting theme, but I think it's interesting to sort of, at least for those of us who work in the sustainability space, or specifically those of us who work in the climate space, to sort of track what he's done over these last 30 years. I mean, he's a natural scientist, trained in chemistry, did a PhD in natural resource management. A long time ago, established a center at the University of Groningen, which is in the north of Netherlands, if you know that part of the world, which looked at energy. Spent many years looking at energy systems, not only in Europe and the Netherlands particularly, but across the world. And then started getting more and more interested in sustainability, especially using systems approaches. So he's one of the sort of leading practitioners of the applications of system dynamics to a whole range of complex questions. We got to meet in the 1980s as part of something that is called the Balaton Group, which effectively is the sort of group of 400 odd researchers from across the world, which over now almost 40 years or so, or 35 years, has helped frame both theoretically and practically the idea of sustainability. At that time, people didn't hear about it. It's now it's gone into other spheres, including sustainable development. Many of us came from fairly wide-ranging backgrounds, including modeling. Of course, Bert is, again, spent a lot of his life working on models. And we were trying to understand how development in its broadest sense would actually work within what today is called planetary boundaries. He actually led one of the more interesting processes in the climate space in the early 1990s to build one of the first integrated assessment models out of the, what was at that time called RIVM, the Dutch National Environmental Assessment Institute. Did a lot of very interesting work in pushing the boundaries of the application of sustainability to regional development questions, including the Dutch Sustainability Report, one of the first reports of its kind in the world at that point of time. And then he helped develop something that I think has been very influential, certainly in the climate world, the SRES scenarios, which were used in the IPCC assessments, the third and the fourth assessments, which he will talk a little bit about, I think, today to try and frame this discussion, which looked at different ways the world could be constructed and laid out not only the mathematical basis for that, but also the narratives, which have been very important in trying to bring this rather important question into the public domain, especially dealing with questions in the policy space. That's sort of gone on just now to become what we call the SSPs in climate talk. Actually, the SSPs were produced in a sense with people who've been trained with him. So a lot of the researchers that came out of the Netherlands and other parts of the world have actually been trained with him over the last 15 or 20 years. We also did some interesting work. I mean, he reparameterized, for those of you who are modelers, he reparameterized the World 3 model on which limits to growth was produced way back in the early 1990s to try and see how it would work itself out. We were actually quite shocked to find that many parts of the Earth system were actually on track with something that was done in today's world would be a very crude kind of, but still a generic kind of modeling frame. Those of you who know that story would know that, at least notionally carbon emissions as we have it today were actually, in some senses, modeled more than 40 years ago, and they're more or less on track. Plus a lot of interest for those who are simulation people in the area of simulation gaming. He's done a lot of work on trying to use that both as an educational tool and a policy tool. More recently, as he moved out of his sort of research sort of incarnation at MNP as it became, into a full-time academic role at the University of Utrecht. Bert spent a lot of time producing what I would imagine to be one of the seminal texts on sustainability science. So his textbook, which came out, I think, what, 2013, 14? 15? When was the book produced? 15? 14? 14, yeah. From Cambridge is a text that's used pretty much across the world. It's around in the library. Maybe we can bring a copy down so that you can see it. It obviously uses a lot of quantitative methods, but I think the interesting thing as both an academic and a practitioner, because he's also involved with a whole range of actual implementation work in many contexts, both in Utrecht and other places, is the crossover between the natural and the environmental sciences, the policy world, which of course involves a lot of dealing with economics and finance, but the social sciences. So I think a lot of today, what you'll see is his sort of seamless movement across multiple disciplines. And in some senses, sustainability science is about that. It's about trying to bring together a whole range of different disciplinary approaches to addressing this larger question of how we can build and maintain a planet with, well, I guess at the moment 7.5 billion, but going 7.5 going to 9 or 10 billion people in an environment which is seriously constrained in terms of resources, inequality, poverty, and a whole range of other things. So, of course, he's going to be talking more on on some of the philosophical questions behind this today. But it's that movement back and forth between the humanities, the social sciences, the environmental sciences, and of course, strongly backed by maths and the physical sciences behind that, which makes some of both his methods-based work and his writing quite interesting. So, but you can, go for as long as you want at the moment. And we'll have a good conversation at the end of this, hopefully.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to speak and also for the introduction. As to me, it sounds quite impressive, but you have to divide it by 40, because that's the time period in which I did all this work. Basically, today I built on a talk I gave in April at the Resilience Center in Stockholm, and later also as a sustainability lecturer at the University of Utrecht. So it's ongoing work. And it also consists more or less of two parts. The first part is my somewhat critical evaluation of Sustainable Development Goals. I have to say I was quite skeptical a few years ago, because nobody actually talked about the UN at all. If you asked them, have you heard of the UN Decade for Sustainable Development? Probably, is anyone here who heard about it? Because that was an important decade between 2002 and 2012. And when I finished writing my book, I would ask my students, and even by 2012, no one had heard about this decade of sustainable development and education. So it means that a lot of skepticism about the UN, but at the same time, the last few years, I've noticed that for many people, having the SDGs is kind of a framing. Even if you have a very local group, some people start with, let's say, relating their work to some of the SDGs. So I've become, in that sense, more optimistic. Second remark about this talk, I always have too many sheets with too much text. The main reason is that I always give the lecture as a PDF to the ones who organize it. So if you're interested, especially if it's about quotes, it will be hard to read them during the lecture, at least read all the quotes. Of course, you can make it an exercise for yourself and challenge yourself trying to read everything I show, but basically it will be on a PDF and it's available. So what I would like to discuss in this talk is first a critical discussion of the SDGs within the framework of what I call modernity. Then I will say something about the worldview approach later on, which I use also in my lecturing at the university to engage people with sustainable development. And then I'll say something about various ethical theories and how can we actually apply those theories, some of which have more than 3,000 years of history to the SDGs. So an interesting framing, which was already started by the Club of Rome in 1972, is saying that most of us live somewhat in a time horizon of 1 day to 1 week, and basically in a social space and a broader space of the family. Most of our concerns are just there, or better, here. So it's here and now, like here and now. Now we ask people, if we talk about sustainable development or the SDGs, to somehow engage with points here, which means things which really may cover several generations and which tend to be not just your country, but the whole world. And I think that is a challenge for each of us. At least I also personally see it as a challenge, because it's easy to talk about these things. It's totally different to start thinking about the consequences if you want to change your behavior. Now the SDGs are framed, of course, in a whole history, and I guess most of you know roughly the outline. I mean, we have the Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. We have the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, which was actually the first call to say that development has to happen within certain planetary boundaries, but at the time it was known as limits to growth. Then at some point we got the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and also the Millennium Development Goals. It's interesting to see the two were still more or less separate, because the development goals had to do about development. The ecosystem goals had to do about constraints, and the two didn't really meet. Of course, in the present SDGs, they actually did meet, building upon all kinds of initiatives within, for instance, the IIHDP and the IGBP. I guess most of you are somewhat familiar with all these global networks. Now, if you look at the SDGs, I took out two statements here, two ambitions which are formulated in the SDGs. Equal rights to economic resources, access to basic services, etc. That's in a positive sense. Absence or elimination of physical, emotional, and social suffering, fight against it, etc. That's more in a negative sense. These are really, you could say, grand ambitions. And my analysis is, my evaluation is that the SDGs really reflect modernity as the mainstream worldview of this moment. And it's nicely illustrated, I think, by a statement of someone who was known, he didn't survive it though, during the French Revolution, with a statement which says, expectation of the future may be reduced to these 3 points: the destruction of inequality among nations, the progress of equality among the people of any given nation, and finally, the substantial perfecting of man. And this is, of course, in a way, modernity and Enlightenment at its best. But obviously, if you formulate it into goals like this, ambitions like this, it's really almost utopian ideal. Now, what is modernity? And maybe this is just a philosophical aside, but I think, and this is in a way my main thesis about the SDGs, I think we have to acknowledge that the SDGs are largely framed within the modernity worldview. And if you don't see it that way, then easily you have a number of other worldviews, that means other values and belief systems, already excluded from the start. So the challenge is partly to make sure that we are not going to do that, in my view. If you look at modernity, some issues which probably are known to most of you, the scientific method of empirical reductionism, which gave us all these beautiful gadgets because it taught us how to deal with electromagnetic waves, how to deal with all kinds of chemical reactions, etc. A continuous process of rationalization, specialization, and standardization, which is still going on, which is by some called the ruthless logic of modernity. a belief which is legitimated by science and technology in predictability, planning and control of societal processes. In fact, the statement by Condorcet, 1791, was of course that hope, that dream, that ideal. And finally, the emancipatory ideal, also clearly stated in the Condorcet's statement, of bringing progress and well-being to all people based on the imperatives of justice, equality and participation. So I think this is, in my view, a fair representation of modernity, including, let's say, high modernity, which was in many analyses 1950, 1990, and what has been called late modernity. So I guess most of you will recognize, I hope most of you will recognize some of the elements here. Just to give one explanation here, or one illustration here, the Germans developed in the 19th century the concept of ein Normalbaum, which means that if you exploit a forest, you're actually going to say the tree should have the least diversity. So a tree was defined as an object which should have, I think, 15 centimeters in diameter, should be 6 meters high, it should have a distance to a neighbor of 8 meters or so. So the forest was in fact completely subservient to the exploitative goal. And there are many more examples, and I think usually I talk about Taylorism, which was the way in which you can more or less normalize labor in the early 20th century. Right now, in my view, we are massively witnessing the Taylorism of the mind. Use, say, the software, the platforms, and all that. So that's one illustration of number two. An illustration of number two, or the number four, is a book by one of the fairly dominant sociologists, Giddens, in which he describes this ideal, which is increasingly, especially in late modernity, an ideal of self and the development of self. That also is a whole discussion in itself. There are hundreds of books about this, so I'll be very brief. Forget about this. Now, if you look at modernity in a fairly, or in a more evaluative sense, I would say that, of course, it has brought tremendous changes for better and for worse. The ones for better are quite well known to many people, although in different ways and to a different extent, but you might say it at least satisfies and creates an ever broader spectrum of needs, and it advances differentiation and complexification of human life, which for many of us is seen as a positive element. At the same time, and especially in groups like this, we are quite aware that there are large unintended, unforeseen, and undesirable side effects, which very often have been externalized to indigenous tribes, externalized to the environment, etc. And the list is well known. I don't have to repeat it. I mean, exploitation of people and resources, destruction of large parts of the natural world, concentration of power at various levels, loss of diversity, and also intractable long-term and global risks, a little bit like Goethe's Zauberlehrling. So I think that if you look at it this way, then it's important to realize that modernity nowadays is faced with a number of countercurrents, and I think that that's the setting in which we also have to look at the SDGs. And of course those countercurrents have been already there since the advent of industrialism and Enlightenment. And an important stream were all the Romanticism movements in Europe in the 19th century. Very interesting period actually in Europe. And these people were fighting the claim to knowledge, rationality and power, especially from the science and technology oriented bourgeoisie. And they did this in the name of some more romantic notions like individual freedom, subjective truth, nature with a capital N, community, solidarity, religion, and other irrationalities. And I think if you look at history, you can see, of course, these resisting forces throughout the world and, in fact, throughout the last 100, 200 years. To give you an idea, which is just a simple list, certainly not complete, but you see now a resistance identity, to use the jargon of Castells. Some of you may know his book. And he says, resistance identity means you simply exclude yourself from what's going on, from the mainstream. And that's what we see in ethnic and religious fundamentalism. Partly in response, of course, to globalization, neoliberalism, etc. Activism around identities is also something we see increasingly, and Castells associated with project identity, which is a more proactive, progressive move. For example, critical environmental and feminist movements, which have been quite strong since the 70s. Another response has been, you might say, response to colonialism in a number of political post-colonial ventures, which of course came with the awareness of what really had happened to many of the people who were conquered by the Europeans and the Americans. And finally, what we see also is in the whole process of globalization and its associated trends, the erosion of the nation-state, which is something we are still struggling with and probably will be over the next decades. So these are dynamical responses to modernity, and I think also within science, and I guess many of you again know more or less about this, but within science itself, we know already that the whole mechanistic idea of science, which is still often the popular view of science and technology, is really completely underestimating the complexity of the real world. And we know now these things. We know it partly from a number of philosophers of science. Of course, if you go to the extreme, you become a postmodernist, saying that science is just one other view, one other opinion. That's not the idea, but I won't go into further discussion here. I think what we also learned the last 30, 40 years is something which I indicate here with complex system science. I've been following this for some 10, 15 years within a couple of EU workshops. And I think it's very interesting to see that a number of scientists are now acknowledging the complexity of even relatively simple physical systems, let alone ecosystems, economic systems. That's very good. Finally, the consequence of these things is that the whole paradigm of planning has more or less weakened to the extent that, at least in the circles where I am, many people would say, forget about optimizing, just try to adapt, try to satisfy in the sense of looking for reasonable strategies and not for optimum strategies. The areas which have not yet been reached with this view are mostly macroeconomists, because they keep optimizing in models which have huge failures, but I won't address this now. So having said this, it means that there are a number of responses to modernity, and I think if you agree that the SDGs, at least that's my reading, represent to a large extent modernity, then we have to take into account all these different resistances, responses to modernity in evaluating the SDGs. So I have the question here, can modernity and the SDGs still give us guidance in view of all these trends? Briefly, I would like to address a few issues on the SDGs. First, what is quality of life and the good life? Because in the end, to me, sustainable development is about somehow having quality of life, the good life, for most of us, preferably for longer times. Maybe 7 generations, but that's really long. Another issue, they hardly speak about the role of the state. It has been discussed, of course, in the Declaration of Human Rights and some other conventions, but in the SDGs it's hardly addressed. Then the issue of developing within planetary boundaries. You might argue that there are many interactions between the SDGs which are not considered, which might be making a wish list without realizing that item A on your list can be satisfied, but unfortunately at the expense of item B. If you don't consider this, and also, is sustainable development really possible? That means, is development as conceived in the SDGs possible within those planetary boundaries, which we increasingly appreciate? So, first issue, quality of life. This is one of the statements in the SDGs where it says, sustain per capita economic growth in accordance with national circumstances, and in particular at least 7% gross domestic product growth per annum in the least developed countries. I can understand this target because we always have to think almost in terms of GDP, which is a strange measure because it's the amount of monetary transactions per person, which means that if you include household work, you have a different number than when you do not include it. When you say car accidents are part of my GDP, then you're actually saying the more car accidents, the better, because we then have to work harder. And in fact, one of the interesting perverse effects was, for instance, in my country, the Netherlands, last year or the year before, when I read in the newspaper, this mild winter has really been detrimental to the Netherlands because we sold less natural gas. I mean, you see the kind of thinking here is a bit weird, and we do know that well-being is not well represented by income. We have other measures by now, a number of them. We also know from psychology that well-being is very relative. All kinds of experiments show that your income is something you perceive in relation to your neighbors, sometimes your direct neighbors, especially in terms of the biggest car and that kind of stuff, and it's relative to your own past. If you have no outlook on having a better life than 10 years ago, that's not good. And if you also have an environment in which most of the people around you are 10 times richer than you are, then you feel probably less happy than when most of the people around you are in the same income class. So we know this. And finally, the SDGs do not speak about the things that make life flourishing, that make life worth living. Maybe that's also an omission which we should at least discuss. Having said this, a few illustrations. This is a report which was made by, among others, a colleague of mine in Utrecht. They tried to have a more advanced measure, not just GDP, but many other variables included. They did a huge amount of historical work to establish those for many regions in the world since 1800. And the interesting outcome is that in Europe and the US, GDP growth was actually less than well-being growth until the Second World War. After that, our GDP growth, which largely has to do with the amount of money put into the system, our GDP growth was larger than the growth in well-being. However, if you look at the other regions, it's the reverse. When they were exploited, mostly by Europeans and the United States, their GDP growth at that time was larger than the increase in their well-being. That means the increase in all these variables. But after the Second World War, gradually, their increase in well-being was larger than the increase in GDP. And it's interesting, I discussed it with him, what are the explanations here? And one explanation might be that some of the enabling technologies, like the mobile phone, have had an enormous impact on people's perception of quality of life. And it's not very expensive, certainly not in India. No. So we have this kind of reflections on GDP, on various scenarios, again with one of the large global change models. You see, in a standard scenario, usually it's said we will have 7% growth in the poor countries. What is not said is that we also will have growth in the rich countries. Now look for the year 2050. This is the increase in income in the poor countries. This is in the same period the supposed growth in income in the rich countries. So it's sold actually as convergence, and it is convergence, but in absolute terms, I still have to tell, when I present scenarios, to people in the Netherlands and in Europe, that we will be 40% richer 20, 30 years from now. I mean, we are already extremely rich in GDP terms, also in other terms, but I still have to tell them, we will become much richer. In fact, in absolute terms, 3 times more than many people in the South. Now, what we also did is, we said, okay, if we have this growth, it should go to something which is called basic needs, which is really part of the UN mantra nowadays. Even economists think about it. So, if you look at food, energy, water, we identified, empirical data, the use of these resources as a function of GDP. What we see then, of course, is that there is a trend stabilizing to ever and ever more food intake. Think of obesity, which is now in absolute numbers larger than the people who have not enough food. So we have this trend for food, we have this trend for energy, we have this trend for water. We all know that this is far above the minimum required use. And therefore an interesting question is, if we have this high GDP growth, how are we going to focus it on these basic needs? And how are we going to prevent that those basic needs are in many places provided 3, 4 times the necessary levels, and in other places maybe not at all? And I think this immediately addresses a favorite topic in the UN philosophy, which is human rights. I mean, we have to address simple questions. If an African person gets 6 children, are we saying automatically that those 6 children have the right to have these amounts of food, energy, water? I mean, it's quite a challenge. For many people, it's really something to think twice about. Because why 6 children? And why do I not have any right to discuss the number of children? So these are, I think, issues. Second point, the role of the nation-state. The majority of the SDG goals and targets are about public, not private goods. Some people don't realize this, but look at them. The provision, notably of health and education services, water, energy, supply and protection of nature and environment, is considered of great importance in the SDG. I mentioned here already 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 SDGs. The point is here, how are we going this economic growth, suppose we can have it, channel towards these directions, which is related to the previous question about basic needs. And my critique here is that the role of public goods has to come to a large extent, as far as we know now, from the nation state. But the nation state is hardly mentioned in the SDGs because implicit is that that's the main player, because the nation state is the member of the UN. So it's the responsibility of the nation state to consider this. However, if you read, for instance, one of the recent books by Fukuyama on political order, I think he has a convincing argument that a competent and impersonal state bureaucracy, the rule of law, and democratic accountability are important elements to have a state function adequately and effectively. In many countries, we know this is not there, and it may not be there anytime soon. So we have goals here, and at the same time, the goals are stated by governments who represent states which are hardly able at the moment to implement this. Of course, we can be optimistic, hope that it will go in the right direction. Unfortunately, we see a number of trends which actually go in the wrong direction. So another topic to discuss. And to illustrate this, this is a list by the World Bank of minimal state intervention issues, medium, and activist. So if the state is a minimal state, it should take care of these. If it's an activist state, the other extreme, it should even start redistributing wealth and do industrial policy. These are the SDGs. I ranked them more or less according to these items. And you see that according to such a list, the SDGs are to a large extent assuming an important role for the state. And if you try to quantify this a little bit, and the numbers are just proxies, but suppose we have here the tax revenues as percentage of GDP as a proxy of the scope of the state. And here we have the effectiveness of the government, which can be measured with some of those huge databases by the UN, all proxies. Then what we see is that there is a straight line from very poor countries without hardly any government or effective government, all the way up to the country which in UN is considered paradise, which is Denmark. The Netherlands actually is quite close to it, so I have some idea about what they are talking about. Now we know that this line is of course a beautiful line, and it assumes that the state is able to tax people somehow, and then without too much corruption, spend that money in the proper direction, notably all these goals which I just mentioned, which are presumably a role for the state. We have, of course, ideologically speaking, quite different trends in history for sure, because here you have the minimal effective liberal state. The United States is going in that direction. You might think of certain other places where they experiment with this extreme. We also have the other extreme, the large ineffective welfare state, and some people call France as an example. The point is, there is of course a deep ideological divide here, and the question is which route the various countries here will take, if any at all. And I think we have to discuss much more than is done right now, what we expect of the state and where we think it might go and should go. Sorry?
What is proxy for effectiveness? Like how do you measure effectiveness?
Well, it's actually a measure which Fukuyama derived from the table of governance data as supplied by the United Nations and the World Bank.
Okay.
So you can look it up, and these are proxies. I mean, but it makes, to me at least, some sense. Of course, there is much more to say about all these things, but I try to focus on what I consider as major issues. So the question here is the nation state actually the proper level, given these caveats and questions? And I think we realize that what is really important is institutional performance. That means reciprocity, trust are crucial elements. And one question is, do we have alternative models for institutions and for effective institutions? And I think some of you may know this, the work by Lynn Ostrom is among the, to me, interesting experiments, avenues to proper ways of managing resource systems. We have also quite some other governance models. I mean, you do here a lot of work on cities as a unit which might be much more important than we think nowadays. Local and indigenous communities, regions within the nation state. In Europe, obviously we think these days of Catalonia, we think of Scotland, and resource or by geography determined units like maybe bioreserves. So maybe we should start thinking about other units than the nation state. And the question is, how happy will the members of the UN be with such an approach? Are they equipped to deal with another approach than the nation state. The third point is development within planetary boundaries. The SDGs are great ambitious about material increase in quality of life. I said this already. My big problems here are, of course, that there are huge interdependencies between the various targets. There are probably negative feedbacks from the natural system, think of climate change. And there are also many other unaddressed issues, and I'm not saying the SDGs should address all these issues, but some of them are really very pertinent issues in relation to the explicit goals and targets. For example, the role of extractive industries. Will they surrender? I don't know. Will the Arabs surrender if massive amounts of oil can no longer be burnt or exported? Food trade in the hands now of basically 5-6 huge global companies. What will their role be? So, questions there. Now, my trade has indeed been to do global change modeling for the last 25 years. And in fact, what we see now is that already in the Brundtland report, development and sustainability were more or less confronted, but they were still quite optimistic. They thought, yes, it's possible to have development within the then known boundaries of the planet. In the SDGs, now, 25, 30, 40 years later, we realize that that may be tricky, but then we have always this, in Latin, deus ex machina, which is technology. The idea is we are smart, look at the last 200 years, so we will be able to overcome many of those stresses. Look at the SDGs, double the agricultural productivity in target 2, substantially increase water use efficiency, target 6, double the global rate of improvement energy efficiency, target 7. So beautiful targets, I fully subscribe to them, and I guess most of you do as well, but they are quite ambitious, as we know. Now, interestingly, this limits to growth, and you mentioned this, Arma, this 1971 limits to growth project suggested, unlike the Brundtland report, which was 15 years later, that maybe we cannot deal with so much growth within planetary boundaries. And many of you may have seen this graph, population growth, remaining natural resources, food production, industrial production, pollution. It's all very aggregate, so it's just a model-based illustration of what might happen with system Earth. But at the time, they had a default scenario, and it was updated. We did some work in 1991 in Beyond the Limits, which suggests already forget it, beyond. And they did another republication in 2005, but the basic scenario still is this one. And it suggests that especially we now are living in, as the Chinese say, interesting times, because this is the period in which things may actually start to become increasingly under all kinds of pressure. Now, the update you talked about by Turner in 2014 goes all the way up to 2011, I think, and this attempt to validate the limits to growth model suggests that we are indeed, in terms of resources and pollution, in terms of industrial and service growth, and in terms of population, fairly nicely on track. Of course, that doesn't mean necessarily that we will remain on track and have a massive catastrophe within 20 years from now, but it is, I would say, somewhat disconcerting that we have indeed still graphs which suggest that we are on the verge of serious stresses, if not serious catastrophes. Now, in the late 90s, we developed for the IPCC those SRS scenarios you mentioned already. And what we tried to do is to get away from these aggregate models, which had basically no social dynamics in it. In my view, is limits to growth actually quite a technocratic exercise with a model. And you could play with a few variables, as I did, and the whole crisis disappeared. The point is, playing with variables in a model is different from running the real world, quite a lot different. So we tried in the IPC to come up with model-based narratives. And in the narratives we say, suppose you can flatten the Earth to the dimension of regionalization versus globalization, and the dimension of emphasis on material wealth versus emphasis on sustainability, equity, and other immaterial orientations. And then we made kind of a logic, and we tried to parameterize the big models we had, like our image model, integrated model to assess the global environment. We parameterized those models according to those narratives. And that showed us, you might say, the feasibility, the possibility of particular developments in the world system. The A1 world was the world in which market forces will determine what's going on. It's a little bit globalization, neoliberalism, etc. High tech, but also high economic growth, and therefore quite some tensions, but at least you're rich. Books here, Managing the Planet, Super Capitalism. I was responsible for a different narrative at the time, which gave a large role to the UN. So the whole thinking of our common future and this book, Our Global Neighborhood, were really defining this B1 storyline, which said basically you will have kind of a top-down, UN-driven aspiration for a better world, a more sustainable world, a more equitable world. And what happened there is that you also would have stabilization of population, just like here, but now it was not only because of technology, but also because of changes in lifestyle. We then had two scenarios which were actually a bit more of a failure, certainly at the time when we were enthusiastic, not all, but many, about massive growth, massive technology. So this was a story, Clash of Civilizations, and I also mentioned here the Hunger Games, because that would mean globalization would not be so nice as we expected. We would have all kinds of counteractions, failures, and in the end we would end up with a world with more than 11 billion people, poor, no technology transfer, protectionism, etc. Not a nice story. And in this story the rich people will conclude already now that if this is the world to come, it's better to buy an island and make sure that you are safe. And that's what we see already to some extent. But of course that's only one sign. You also see signs of this world, you also see signs of this world. The last one is kind of a middle of the road because we had no other ways of implementing it, but actually it's a story which says, forget about top-down control, not possible. That's an illusion, a UN-cherished illusion. What will happen is that many people become more and more aware of the rather disastrous ways in which we are living on this finite planet, and they will start their own bottom-up initiatives throughout the world. And it will have different shapes. In India it will be different from Europe, will be different from the United States or African countries. And in this vein you have books like Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, Campbell's book, Easternization of the West. So also more spiritual inclinations are very important here, orientations towards equity, sustainability, but then as a bottom-up local experiment or lifestyle. So we explored those scenarios, and I'm telling you this because the scenario for which, in retrospect, as it turns out, I was responsible, this B1 scenario, is actually a world which at the time was still imaginable, 1999, had the beautiful title, GE in an equity, environment and service-oriented world. And this world was still you might say, a very desirable world. But now, 18 years later, if I show you the latest scenarios, so-called shared socioeconomic pathways from my colleagues, Van Vuren, Rihai and others, former colleagues, I should say, then what we see is the B1 scenario is still a possibility. It still is possible that we have enough development, especially education for women, that population will stabilize at most 9 billion and then go down. We also, in that world, are miraculously able to generate large GDP growth, but fairly beneficial. So you could think of growth in terms of solar panels, in terms of health and education services, so some call it green growth. So we are also rich, but in a different way from the A1 type of rich. This rich is more green and less big cars, private jets, etc. So, green line. Less population, rich, and then of course, this is urbanization, also a line on urbanization. My point is, these days we have also the other scenarios still, and they have a totally different narrative. Population goes to more than 12 billion, and those 12 billion are, to a large extent, poor. Which means that we now have a world which is much less attractive. And what I'm saying here is, 20 years after we made the stress scenarios, we still have the B1 and the A2 possibilities for the future, but obviously the B1 becomes more and more difficult to realize. And if you look at the associated emissions of CO2 as one CO2 equivalent, as one measure of the planetary boundaries, then you see that in the green scenario, this green growth went with a massive decline in emissions. But the A2 scenario is actually a scenario which has a further increase. Why? Well, for instance, China and India in that scenario, and I think it's not really plausible at the moment, but they would keep using their indigenous resource, which is coal, for instance. So you see that in this line, we will also have much temperature increase. That means feedbacks on the whole economic growth process. So in fact, an unpleasant world. And I'm showing you this because this, to me, is an outline of, I should say, the context in which we should discuss the SDGs. And the second part of my talk is about the ethical issues framed in what I call the worldview approach. But perhaps I spent already quite some time, so we might also have some discussion now. I could also continue with this ethical frame. Shall I do that? Then I have to go quite fast, so I hope you forgive me that I just present these thoughts. I have to say I took the opportunity to present this because to me, much of the discussion on values and beliefs and more broadly on ethics is very Western dominated. So where are the views, the insights, the values which are vital still in a country like China and in a country like India? Where are those voices? I don't hear them. Usually the SDGs are framed within modernity with the assumption that China and India will in the end understand that modernity is the best way of life. It's the way to go. And maybe many of you agree, that's fine, but I tend to say that that may mean that we will give up on sustainability. So let me briefly then introduce the worldview approach. I go very fast. I apply it in this textbook, which you mentioned. It's also in the book of my colleague, Klaas van Egmond. We say a worldview is a combination of value orientations and beliefs about the world. The pedigree of this approach is in the targets model in the 90s, the IPCC, the sustainability outlook for the Dutch government, etc. And what I propose is to think, and this resembles some of the stuff in the IPCC scenarios, to think of two dimensions, which could make this complex affair a little bit more structured. So that's all I claim, that it's a heuristic framework to discuss very complex issues, namely the whole role of values and beliefs in what will happen on the planet. And as I say here, it's a meta framework, and I would like to apply it, that's my present venture, to a couple of ethical questions. Now, the first dimension is, in fact, based also on insight from perennial wisdom, you might say, the tension between the personal, the particular, and the individual versus the societal, universal, and group. And you have here all kinds of traditions which tend to corroborate that this indeed is an important dimension. And is it related to ethics? Well, there's a nice statement by Russell, whom I appreciate a lot as a philosopher. Ethics is rooted in desire and the necessity to reconcile the entirely individual desire with that which is collectively desirable. Quite pragmatic, but still quite sensible. The other dimension is the one which you also will recognize from the IPC, which is the material body exterior versus the immaterial mind interior. And you may say, well, that's really an axis which is a little bit romantic, or which is not really relevant for hardcore people like most of us here. The point is, just think about your own attempts to relate your own work to sustainable development, and you will quickly see that if you only deal with quantitative indicators, most of your neighbors will just not relate to what you're saying. Most of the common people, so to say, will not relate to what you're saying. Because for many of us, life is not about those, or at least only partly about those indicators. Much of our life is about indicators higher up, so to say. Things like how about corruption? How about accessibility? How about the distribution of income? How about public goods delivery? And if you go even higher, you have a whole bunch of social scientists who are now trying to do this in terms of the happiness index, subjective well-being index. So if you choose indicators to communicate your own work, usually you have to think about which level you will choose. And in fact, the hierarchy of needs is of course something which is known also in India and in other philosophies already for a long, long time. And there is one beautiful statement. Again, I said things are going too fast, but Baudelaire beautifully said, I mean, he was a very romantic poet, which is fact of life. There are in every man at all times two simultaneous tendencies, one towards God, the other towards Satan. The invocation of God or spirituality is the desire to follow the road upward. To invoke Satan or animality is taking delight in falling down. Some will say this is typically Christian outlook, which is true to some extent, but I think it lingers in many civilizations. We try to corroborate this with surveys. For example, a couple of thousands of Dutch citizens were followed for 10 years or so. We did cluster analysis, and we found that values actually cluster somewhat around, it's always complex, somewhat around those four corners of this space. And I have no time to go into any detail here, but this is the outcome of studies we did between 2000 and 2008, I think. Now, what it means is that you might argue that as an individual, you develop in directions which have to do with your inner growth and with your social frame, context. And I think if we posit the individual as someone who matures, you might say, in this whole process, then we can also put some of these dimensions and corners in terms of inner development, art, mysticism, a moral order, as is done in many religions, the socio-political order, which is used to be known as kings and castes, but also laws and science, and an economic order. And this individual outlook is, of course, also something which is visible in institutions. And I think if you look at the institutions which are the prominent ones in the various corners of this worldview space, then you can see that here you will usually have corporate business and national governments. Here you might have the UN with its lofty goals, but also religions, churches, and here you may have artists, gurus, and more generally speaking, critical people. And here you might have consumer groups, local citizen groups, etc. It's just a very crude approach. Now, my point is, if you look at, again, some of the ambitions in the SDGs, I have shown these before, you quickly realize from the definition of ethical statements that these are very ethical. I mean, the SDGs really represent an ideal. And that ideal is, in a way, a prescriptive statement which also is considered universal. The UN especially thinks it's universal. It's something for the whole of humanity, which is also in the Human Declaration of the Declaration of Human Rights. It is about conscious actions and towards alternative. So if you look at the definition of sustainable development, nobody, I think, or let me put it the other way, most people would agree they are indeed ethical. Now, if they are ethical, then we are questioning the roots of ethics and morality. There are at least a zillion books about this. But I think what we have to realize, again in relation to what I said about modernity, that to summarize it, the concept of the rational individual of modernity is a limiting assumption in exploring ethics. We might think, especially as economists are doing, that we are rational beings within the modernist worldview. I think, especially if stresses start to work, forget about rationality. Very often it's much other stuff like status, emotions of all kinds of nature. So basic non-rational emotions and desires resurface in times of collapsing order and chaos. So if we understand, or at least agree with this, then you look at the various, underneath is this frame of the worldviews, you look at the various ethics in traditional societies, and you realize that they had, of course, a hero morality and a taboo or herd morality. Many people have written about this, and that was quite rough. And only gradually people started to have state institutions. Already in an early stage, priests were involved. Self-realization as more spiritual approach were involved. I won't go in any detail here, but from this we developed what I would say two ethics which are still extremely dominant in our dealing with, for example, sustainable development. The first one is industrial era ethics. The first one is what I call, or what has been called, libertarian. Small role for the state, great relevance of property rights, and it was, of course, focusing very much on individual freedom. Understandable, because in the 18th century, in Europe, there was such an oppression of most of the people that liberty really was something to aspire for. So it's understandable, but at the same time, it may not be the right ethic for the Anthropocene. The second, also known to most of you, is utilitarian approaches, because that too is very individualist in its basis, because it suggests that there is a utility curve. What is utility? Well, upon thinking about it, even someone like Stuart Mill said, well, maybe it's not really such a simple concept as we hoped it would be. And it also suggests that the essence of moral judgment is your individual preference for things. That's why it has been called emotivism, hedonism. So this is also a very dominant ethic, but is it helpful? Well, this ethic has at some point been applied very much in our global models, namely as social utilitarianism. What do you do? You assume that you have GDP growth. That gives you the consumption per person. That's converted into utility per person based on a curve which says that the 10th potato is less interesting to you than the first potato. And then you say we are now going to maximize utility. This is still the practice in most of the work for the IPC with macroeconomic models. So this is deeply ingrained in our macroeconomic thinking, also about climate policy. And we should realize this. It means we go for the maximum in the sense of the greatest happiness of the greatest number, which was Bentham's expression. It's not wrong, but it certainly is a particular approach to ethics in relation to the SDGs. And I would add some elements which has been discussed widely by philosophers. If you really follow utilitarianism, social utilitarianism, there is a fair chance that you end up with a totalitarian state. Because why not then sacrifice a few people for the benefit of a huge crowd, like the Romans did long ago? Because if you make the sum, it may actually mean that the total sum is bigger than when you do not sacrifice those few people or those minorities or whatever. So it raises really ethical issues, and I think the book The Circle is in this respect a nice example of what would happen if the Googles, the Amazons, the Facebooks, etc. finally merge into one big company, which, as in this book, suggests, why do we elect politicians? We have all the data. Why not just let the world be run by us? And I think people like Zuckerman probably would go along with this argument quite a while. So I think there are dangers here. I'll quit here. Then there is another ethic which is associated with Enlightenment, notably Kant, because at some point people said, of course, okay, now God is no longer there, so we have to find something which is rooted in human beings, somewhat universal, but which can do without God. And that's how he came with things like the categoric imperative. Rawls was following up on this and had, for example, the difference principle, which is very important and very consequential, because it says those favored by nature may gain from their good fortune only on terms that improve the situation of those who have lost out. Imagine you are really applying this. That's very consequential. So then we have also a number of other ethical considerations like Sen and some other people, but I won't bother you with this. There is one more ethic which maybe is the most important if we really want to have the dialogue. This is based, you might say, on already ancient religions, Buddha, Confucius, Aristotle, but it has been revived, for instance, by McIntyre. And the essential thing is, forget about all the utilitarian approaches. Forget about doing something good or being good only as part of an accounting business. So I am doing good or I am good because I made the calculation that then in the end I will benefit. And even Kant is somehow amenable to this kind of argument. The difference is that in Christianity, most of the repayments would be later in heaven, and with Kant, they would preferably be already during your life. So he has a very interesting book, McIntyre, called After Virtue, which tries to work out, and here I have some statements which are worthwhile, I think, to read. My own position is these, including also Deep Ecology by someone like Arne Nees, are, to me, the seeds of ethics for the Anthropocene. And I miss this almost completely in the discussions and the framings of the SDGs. And I think that's wrong. And why is this wrong? Well, these are some, you can have a look at it, some applications where I say, what will the different ethics say about a particular target, like here, target 4.1, education, or here, the one on genetic resources. 15.6. And each of those perspectives gives you a fairly different position and so-called problem framing and solution. And you can also frame it in terms of causal loop diagrams, which is the system approach I favor very much in my own lecturing. And then you can see that, for example, a simple question, what about the whole notion of population growth, can be addressed from various different angles. But again, I want to go fast here. Now, you can schedule these various ethical positions in this worldview frame, and my claim is the world of the SDGs is somewhere here on the side of the UN-oriented governments. That's, you might say, the global elite, traveling a lot. He does, I did. And of course it's okay, it's not wrong, but you should realize there are very different views in the world. Just to mention a few, the USA government, the world is not a global community, but an arena in which nations, organizations and companies compete with each other in order to make progress. The Pope, which says capitalism is the source of evil. All kinds of eco-villages who claim to build up from below spiritual orientations, alternative technologies, and of course we have this massive amount of advertisements to which we are exposed almost every minute. I just took one here from the Palladium, Mumbai, which promises you beautiful things, like one big billboard I saw here, escape into tranquility, huge billboard nearby, beautiful. So these worlds exist, and you may forget, if you're part of this UN scene, that many people actually live in parts of these worlds. So my statement would be, let us try respectfully to look at all the angles and not just the one which tends to focus very much on science and technology and on modernity. And that would mean that we should avoid extremes, because the extremes in the end, look at the past, have led to things like inquisition, corporatocracy, narcissism, sects. And I'm not the only one. I recently discovered that Maarten Heyer, Johan Ronstrom, and some other of the global crew have also proposed that we should leave the cockpit world of the SDGs and that we should focus on, in their setting, things like planetary boundaries, but also green competition, which is the industrial outlook, safe and just operating space, which is the environmental outlook, energetic society, which is especially the individualist entrepreneurial outlook. So, of course, one last remark, if we do this, there is a trade-off. If we really think we should focus very much on bottom-up and also somewhat, you might say, spiritual, immaterial, non-economic orientations, then we have to give up the idea that it's possible to have top-down control and therefore force upon us a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise by 2100. That's not going to happen, because if you have all those local initiatives, who can predict in any way what will be the outcome in terms of emissions? It's just impossible. All you can do is have the right intention, have good hope, work along those lines, do your best, and hope for the best, and give up on too much top-down control. I know this is somewhat controversial in some circles, but I think already in the past we had many practical suggestions here. And finally, if people then ask me what to do, last time in Stockholm I made a small list which could be the list of things which make to me sense right now. Slow down, buy local, be a circular consumer, earn enough and not more, invest green, live local, think global, and be aware and human. And I think I have a map here, which is an interesting map, made 30 years ago by the director of Heineken Beer, in which he said Europe should become a continent of 28 different regions. Forget about a nation state, it's totally dysfunctional. Interesting thought, because it fits in this whole idea of decentralizing, contextualizing, and giving much more attention to what I call the B2 bottom-up initiatives. Whether that will work, we shouldn't give up the B1, but at least I suggest to have attention at least for the B2. So that's it, because
Okay, good. Thank you very much. So, questions and responses.
So you have covered quite some ground in your lecture. You started from sustainability, spirituality, and now to ethics. So it makes it very hard to ask you one question. But you concluded saying that one should avoid extremism. Now here is my question. Would it be extreme to say that the notion of the good life, as propagated by the SDGs, limit themselves to just human life and do not include all life on this planet? Would it be now extreme to say that the SDGs should move on to include all life and not just a need-based approach to human life?
well, the answer is, to me, fairly simple. We should include all life, and obviously the animals will not present with all those, during all those meetings. And what it means is then again, that if you propose this, you will see that within the different worldviews, the responses, the framing of the problem, the ethics of the solution will diverge. I mean, we had, for example, my students, because I always ask my students to engage in small groups, to engage with the 4 different worldviews. And one group of bright students did this with the question, how about meat production in the Netherlands? And then you see, of course, that there are powerful industrial lobbies to make sure that in the Netherlands and in Europe, the meat industry will not go down the drain. And they have massive support from many consumers who still really don't want to consider even to stop eating meat. So you immediately run into this kind of debate, because you also have now so-called Party for the Animals in the Netherlands, which is a fairly successful party, and they are against any eating of meat. They think we really should get away from all this, become vegetarian or even vegan, which is fairly extreme. So those groups exist. The real challenge is, I mean, you may have this extremist view, someone else may have a different extremist view. The real challenge is, of course, to acknowledge that we are together, increasingly with more people, and that we somehow have to find a solution. And one possible solution, of course, is that one group grabs the power, abolishes democracy, and realize their own solution. But that's not the favorite way for most of us. The most of us would say, let's have a dialogue in the middle and see how we can somehow accommodate these very different values and beliefs and these very different positions. Is that answering your question?
I think what you're saying is that it is not possible for human beings to include all life, because we are going to separate ourselves from the other. Is that what you're saying?
I could also return the question, what does it mean to you, include all life? Include all life, does it mean that you are willing to give up your life for the benefit of whales?
We don't know if we need that. That's what I mean.
That's true, we don't know. But on the other hand, I sometimes have discussions about this. We could invite the whales to the discussions, but maybe it doesn't work.
What I mean, sir, is that we don't know the relationship of the man, the environment, and the economy. We don't know it adequately. So our notion of sustainability is to just provide man what he needs without knowing what the environment needs. So the need-based approach, according to me, is just inadequate. And
okay, that's already a more specific statement. And I tend to agree that if the need-based approach is really omitting the rest of nature, then it's absolutely, in my view, insufficient. But I still have to tackle many people who say, listen, if I have to choose between an animal which is starving and some human being which is starving, I choose a human being. So, any other contribution to the debate? Because I hope that someone would say that the Indian philosophy has to contribute something in this respect. Or do you think that it's outdated anyway?
I have a separate question. So, do you think in part the graph we saw for GDP versus well-being has something to do with the hedonic treadmill? Is that we just get used to whatever we're given, and that we can continue to expect such kind of trends even with sustainable growth?
Are you now talking about the graph I showed with
Well-being versus GDP,
with
happiness versus GDP,
with
life satisfaction versus GDP, one of those.
with the expanded GDP?
Right.
Yeah. So what exactly is your question then?
So I'm saying if people adapt really quickly and those measures aren't really very good because of the hedonic treadmill where you keep wanting more and more,
yeah.
and that you can expect the same for even sustainable growth, like apart from material wealth.
Well, that links a little bit to what I said about the role of perception of well-being in relation to other people and in relation to your own past. And I must say some of my hopes have diminished because of the fact that now with the media we have these days, the expectations of many people all over the planet start to become, you might say, completely unrealistic. But nevertheless, they are there in their minds and maybe in the rest of their life as well. So indeed, such phenomena like hedonic treadmill may nullify all the progress we make. I don't know. It would be quite bad. Economists would study it in a more pragmatic sense of the rebound effect. So I don't know whether it really will be detrimental for most of the advances we hope to make. You have much more experience. In your experience, do you think that now, because also of social media, a large fraction of the Indian population is expecting, your generation, expecting to have, let's say, at least the kind of lifestyle which you see on the television for the better to do Americans? You think so? For a large fraction of people here in India?
Yeah, I think that's what's happening, and I think it's seeping into other, I think it's seeping into different pockets of the country as well. And it's not maybe just people in cities, but people in, it's like, where do you draw the, like, how do you define a good quality of life, right? It just becomes what you see in the media, as the Western quality of, Western standard of living, let's say. And perhaps in many instances, some of the indigenous or not even indigenous, but just local traditions or customs or whatever, they do present a certain quality of life that isn't necessarily bad, but that's not really, like you said, it's not really being considered. You don't really think about whether you need the Eastern or the Western or which parts of what to take. It just kind of becomes...
So in fact, if I understand you correctly, partly those traditional ways of life, which have their own setting of well-being, are swept away by the forces of modernity, reinforced by social media, reinforced by massive advertisements. And this is exactly what I've seen. For example, I've two times stayed a couple of weeks in Ladakh. And this is exactly what we see all over the world. And this is this ruthless logic of modernism. So I'm not reproaching you that you follow it, because it's really so seductive, it's so appealing. I mean, you can fly all over the place. So finally you can, even here in India, you can easily go from Chennai to Mumbai, Delhi, all this. Same in Europe. My students now think it's really natural to have at least 2 times a holiday somewhere in the Mediterranean or so. And many of them will actually even go with their young children to Thailand. I mean, what's the problem? Unless it's unstable there, or unless you have spotted a terrorist, it's fine. So, indeed, what are we going to do if these expectations keep rising?
So if I can add to what you just said,
Sure.
modernity is fundamentally changing the notion of well-being and freedom in our country. For example, well, freedom is a very internal concept in India. It has been an internal concept. Whereas, as you said in your lecture, that freedom in the Western world comes from knowledge, rationality, and power. But so let me explain it to you this way. If you take 10 Westerners and put them into an Indian train, they would complain about lack of freedom. Whereas if you take 100 Indians and put them into the same train, all they would want is the freedom to pray to different gods. So, what the current modern view is doing is making us think that freedom comes from being powerful or being materialistic, which has not worked in this land before. And it is interesting to see how it will change. If a billion people think that freedom comes from materialistic growth, what is to become of the world?
Well, look at China. In China, more than 1 billion people think that they should continue with 7% growth per year. They may not realize it, but nevertheless, we have seen now the last 20 years what happens if they are successful. And they are very pragmatic, so they're also partly a part of the solution within the A1 world, but increasingly they are suffering from the consequences, for example, climate change, and therefore they are moving a little bit to the B1 world. They are very top-down oriented, so we have to face them as part of the global community. And if you put 100 Chinese then next to your 100 Indians, you have already two very different worlds. And I don't know what will be the outcome of all this, but at least we should become honest about it and not play the game that basically everyone will become modern in the way in which especially the Americans are modern, and that's the way to go. There is actually no other way, because all of you in the end just want this. And I challenge this, but maybe I'm too optimistic, because sometimes I must say, having lived for a month in the US recently, that lifestyle and the way it's sold is so, as I said, seductive and appealing, that after 1 or 2 weeks, I started also to think, living in the US, why would I give up this lifestyle? I have the money. Should I give it up for something bad in 2050? Should I give it up because some poor people get too many children? Why would I give it up? So let's just do these experiments, because these are very real world thoughts for many people outside the circle of people who are having good intentions like us and who do sustainability related work, etc. And then indeed it may be that we already are past a certain point, and if that's the case, then of course the essential metaphor of limits to growth is correct. We will only start changing if serious feedbacks start to happen. And that's my concern, because then if that happens, we should now have a strategy which focuses primarily on resilience, because I can tell you, if that happens, there is a fair chance that the rich will anticipate this and make sure that they will not seriously suffer, despite all the fires and the floods in near Los Angeles recently. And that means that the poor are left more or less on their own, and the best strategy is then to be resilient in the sense that you prepare for coping with serious feedbacks. But that's not really the kind of sustainable development goal frame which is sketched in the SDGs. And I can tell you, when we did the scenarios for the IPCC, we were forbidden to discuss collapse or catastrophic scenarios. We could not even mention the probability that in Africa they would lag with economic growth or even have a kind of a collapse. Not permitted. Yeah.
So do you think that wealth distribution can solve major problems? especially when it comes to people owning things. So then we can put a line across how much is required to sustain life.
So what kind of solution you said in the beginning?
Wealth distribution.
Distribution.
Yeah.
If I would voice the preferred European perspective, as I see it right now, Europe had the best perspective, sorry to say so because I'm European, but still I think we have the best perspective to find the proper balance in the welfare state between, let's say, the public and the private, and between the welfare in a broad sense and the external constraints. So I think if Europe gets its act together, finally, maybe thanks to the newly elected president in the US, who is doing things which fortunately give a lot of creativity now in Europe, then the European vision might become stronger, and part of that vision is to make sure that the state takes up its distributional role, its role to take care of affordable health services, affordable educational services. And it's quite illustrative perhaps that the UK is now leaving Europe, because the UK has experienced the last 20, 30 years a really American-oriented neoliberal trajectory. And in that sense, they are already a little bit away from Europe. So I hope that that model will become stronger. It's not the only model, by the way. I could imagine that here in India, you also maybe have different models, because your deities you just mentioned are also, of course, possibly part of the solution. Not always something we easily envisage, but it's possible. Even in the US, you have evangelicals, not my preferred type of person, but you have evangelicals who are favoring a much more restrained lifestyle, who don't agree at all with all this consumer capitalism and all that stuff. So there are different directions, but the European welfare state, to me, which has unfortunately been eroded significantly by neoliberal forces and globalization, but that still is a model which I think is very, very, how to say, very good.
Then that would also help in decentralization.
That's an interesting question, because as soon as you say that in Europe the governments have to give away power, then you touch very sensitive issues. For example, in my view, look at that map. The whole struggle in Catalonia, down there in Spain, was to me a very valid attempt to rewrite a little bit history as it has grown in Spain. The same for the Scots people. But Brussels was absolutely responding in a completely negative way. So also in Brussels, which is dominated by neoliberal business interests, unfortunately, there is still this fear that if you allow bottom-up initiatives, you lose control, you lose power, you lose money. So don't do it.
I think that's same in India as well, even in Bangalore. So
I could imagine indeed that if you venture in India also in this direction, which I suggested here, you will have fierce resistance, strong resistance from maybe Delhi, all India government, because many of the people there have worldviews in which they are only to lose with such strategies, which is a pity. I think we should teach them that there's actually a lot to gain, but that requires some more reflection and maybe philosophical work.
Do you find it problematic that the SDGs are still made from a very anthropocentric point of view that don't really urge people to view themselves as being part of a larger system?
That they are still very anthropocentric.
Yeah.
That's a little bit related to the previous questions about animals. Well,
but I don't mean specifically animals, but more from the point of view of, like we are part of a larger system.
Well, the short answer would be that I mentioned not only virtue ethics, but also deep ecology as one of the two ingredients for an ethic of the Anthropocene. Because if we are not reconsidering our relation with nature in a much broader sense, and not just in terms of measurable planetary boundaries, but also in terms of emotions, in terms of spiritual connections, then I'm afraid we are not going to find proper directions for sustainable development. That's my personal conviction. And that's why I mentioned deep ecology as an ingredient, which of course is connected with the virtue ethics, because the virtue ethics emphasizes the role of internal goods. I mean, those of you who are interested, I can recommend this book by McIntyre on After Virtue. It's a little bit Aristotelian, and some people say, wow, this is old-fashioned medieval scholastics. I think it's not, because the difference between internal and external goods is in a way very important. If you do something as an internal good, for example, as a teacher in a village, you realize that it's in a way your duty, but you are doing it as good as possible without expecting rewards. It's almost like in the Bhagavad Gita, actually. If you focus, like our society is doing most of the time, mostly on the external rewards, and you keep making accounting calculations, then the chances that you are at some point degraded by the institutions, like I see now in the university, are very large. In my view, universities, we have many scientists who are no longer working based on internal curiosity, internal rewards in terms of discovering things. It's really to a large extent now about publication. It's to a large extent about getting funds. So institutions tend to move away from internal goods. I think if you focus on the internal goods, the relationship with the rest of the living world is also something which is much nearer.
In a top-down way, let's say, or how do you make people give up certain lifestyles or certain ways of living to do that, I mean?
To be honest, all I can do is tell my students, and they are still, well, we had over 150 students. It's a small proportion of the world population, I admit, but nevertheless, we had 150 plus students, and what I tell them is, in the end, what really matters is whether you mature in a way, you become more aware, you develop your own critical attitude, and even if they then start doing things which I may consider wrong and unsustainable, etc., then at least it's out of a certain awareness, certain intelligence, certain critical attitude. And that's as far as I can go. I think there is the statement by Lynn Ostrom, there is no panacea. I mean, there is no magic formula which I, at the end of this lecture, can give you on a closed piece of paper.
Last question?
Yeah. So my question is regarding the balance. So how can we define this balance as we are facing so complexity in the social and ecological structure as well? And as we are seeing this whole notion of SDGs from an ethical reflection point, how can we really go down to those social structures who are dealing and struggling in their daily lives with natural resources and their personal lives? So how can we define balance, and how can we define them what balance is? Also, how behavioral studies can play a role in this whole concept, because if we are talking about ethics, then obviously the behavioral aspect would be a very important aspect in this.
Well, maybe I should just quickly go to this graph or to this causal loop diagram, which I showed here. I didn't discuss it. This is an example which is a somewhat academic answer, because as I said, the magic formula with which I can send you home and then you start practicing and then next month you have the solution doesn't exist. So if you look at this problem of population growth, I have attended several debates in which people almost became violent on the issue of population growth. Some people denouncing the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church as the real evil because they are against abortion. Other people who would say the Chinese are the evil force because the government there had this one-child policy. So the question to me is, let us first try to understand how from different perspectives people come up with a perception of the problem, perception of preferred solutions, their arguments, and then at least you create a middle ground if you are still respectful. I mean, if you have already left the room with loud screams, then it doesn't work. But suppose you still have the people together, then you can start to realize that many of these solutions will be contextual. It makes no sense that an American person starts to cause a lot of havoc in the debate because he is excited about what the Pope says about people in Africa. That doesn't make much sense. We can much better see what is the situation, more specifically, for instance, in India. And I think you face huge challenges, obviously, but those challenges may have to do from the government perspective on maybe things like family planning, which you have some fairly disastrous experience with. You may think of education of women. You may think of the role of those deities. You may think of poverty, which means that many people say more children means more security in life for the old age. These are the real forces. And I think once you are able to at least discuss this and even have your emotions with it, then you create a space in which you very often, in my perception, could come up with solutions. Are they then also implemented? I must say, I don't know. I yesterday had a talk with a colleague from IIHS here, and he had a story about a village in Assam. And he said, we wanted to have a village without electricity for testing options for renewable energy. And they went to that village, and then the local guy of the electricity company discovered that some people from Bangalore, all the way from Bangalore, had come to his village. And he said, why are people coming from Bangalore? Why is there not already an electrical cable to that village? 6 months later, this village, which had been asking for electric power for 10 years or so, got its line. So what it means is that the local situation is so dependent in its final implementation on the people, the power relationship between the people, their interests, their emotions, beliefs, that you can probably never do something with a certain guarantee of success. It's just not possible. So try, hope, try, start up such things, and then hopefully you create that space, that's my view at least, in which solutions become visible and may even with a little bit of luck be successfully implemented. That would be my answer.
Good, thanks. We can have it. If you want to balance it, I think some people need to get.
Yeah, no, we will officially close this down now, but Professor de Vries is here. And thank you all for coming in for our publics, and please do keep tuned in to our Facebook page. Announcements will happen over there. Thanks.
Yeah. And thank you for the questions. Oops.
Question saying, what your students, right, and how you try to maybe propagate this